So just a few PowerPoints for us on, and I'm going to need a little help, gentlemen.
There you go.
Okay, great. So this first map is the long sweep of the evolution of the the Russian Imperial Empire. As you can see, if you can spot Moscow there on the far left, Moscow started out rather small in the 1500s, but the Romanovs came to power in 1613. Their Romanov rule would be 1613 to 1917. And in 300 years, they created the largest empire in history. Certainly the largest nation state, encompassing many lands, many ethnicities, many nationalities, and an extraordinary number of spoken languages. So that is the Russian Empire that Putin remembers reading about as a boy. That empire, the Russian Imperial Empire, came to a close in 1917 when the Romanovs were toppled by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were intent on keeping the imperial landmass, and a very ugly civil war was waged between 1918 and 1923, probably 4 to 5 million fatalities. But at the end of that war, the communists emerged victorious, and they established the Soviet Union. And the empire would now go from an imperial empire to a communist empire. And that empire would last from 1923, really, to 1991. During that time frame, the empire was expanded to include the lands of Eastern Europe. And so you see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, which had been made part of the excuse me, not Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They were free for a short period of time in the interwar years. But in World War II, the countries of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, East Germany were all occupied by the Soviet Union, and Moscow imposed puppet governments on each of those states. Now, it's very important. Why did they do this? From Stalin's perspective, he was very clear at Yalta. This was because in the space of the past 150 years, Russia had been invaded 3 times by the West: the Napoleonic Wars, the Kaiser in World War I, and Hitler in World War II. He was emphatic with Roosevelt and Churchill saying this would not happen again. He was closing off that flat land that those tanks were able to cross and those horses were able to cross. So that's the expanse of the Soviet Empire. And in 1991, as you all know, the Soviet Union collapsed, as all empires eventually do. That should be sent to our friends in Beijing. 30, 40, 50 years from now, I would not expect the Chinese empire to be who they are today, maybe a little longer than 50 years. So that empire came to an end in 1991. And Putin watched it. And he would like to reconstitute elements of that empire. And that's been very clear watching him in the last 30 years. But he does not have a lot of cards to play. Meg and John and I, when we talk about power, we talked about interest, we talk about power in international politics, we talk about the different kinds of power: military power, economic power, and political power. Putin only has military power, and he's done a fine job of retooling the Russian military since the 2008 war in Georgia, and we're seeing it on display right now. As far as economic power, does anybody have on them right now a garment that says "Made in Russia"? Of course not. He's presided over a failed economy. All he does is export raw materials, and he's going to find that really cutting thin as he goes forward in this campaign. He has virtually no political alliances. Even the Chinese, if you watch closely in the last week, are doing quite a dance in how they're interacting with Putin. I'll close by just saying a few things about NATO, because this is very much on Putin's mind as well. The NATO alliance existed between 1949 and 1991. It was without question the most successful military alliance in history, and yet it did not fire a shot. Its deterrence was very credible, and the Soviets respected it, and we respected the Soviets. 1991, the Soviet Union comes to an end. The question is, what do you do with NATO? There was a debate that I participated in. The question is, what do you do with NATO? And the ultimate decision led by the American government under President Clinton, which was to listen to the Central Europeans, the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, and expand NATO to the east. We did this without the overt threat to Moscow, but if you're Putin, how do you read that expansion? Do you read it as, oh, these nations just want to be a part of a friendly alliance? And then we increased it to the states that once belonged to the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And this has a great deal to do with why we are here today. Putin feels threatened. He also feels, I think, that this is the time to push the envelope. Until this past few days, I think he has read the West as being very weak in response, and that can be to the war in Georgia, it can be to the conflict in Crimea in 2014, it can be to the fact that we seem to permit him to engage the Syrian conflict. The Soviets never were in the Middle East during the Cold War, but there's Soviet MiGs over Damascus, extraordinary times. He sees the West as being divided. He sees the rise of some authoritarian regimes in different states in the system. And so I believe he saw this as an opportunity to go forward. But as I said, I think he's made extraordinary miscalculations. I hope that the press doesn't say Rupp says Putin is rational on the headlines tomorrow, because I'm not saying that Putin is rational, but I am saying it's a useful tool in analyzing this conflict. I'm now going to turn it over to Meg Rincker, who's going to be taking up some of the more domestic matters within Ukraine. So let me just press on.
Thanks.
Meg? Oh, sure.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you. My name is Meg Rincker. You can hear me all right? Good. So yes, I wanted to speak a little bit to the domestic factors within Ukraine to understand a bit more what's been going on within the country and why I think I'm kind of building on what Professor Rupp is saying about NATO expansion and EU expansion and enlargement to the east and to the Russian Federation's doorstep as being a threat. But as I kind of go through and describe some of the key actors, people who have served as presidents in Ukraine in the 30-year history of the country as a burgeoning democracy, I guess the thesis of what I'm trying to get at is that I think that Putin is afraid of the pluralism, the competition that has been emerging electorally within Ukraine, and sees that as a real threat. Because of course, he's used to a system of utter stability, right? A system where Yeltsin tapped Putin on the shoulder to be executive, and where Putin expects, even though he's supposedly limited till 2036 to be president, now that he's changed the constitution through amendment, he's used to a system where you can predict who the president is, and there's not this uncertainty. So I'm setting my timer because I'm trying to be accountable. If I'm asking Putin to be accountable, I'm trying to be accountable. So this first slide, right, just shows a map of Ukraine, right? We know that Kyiv is situated on the Dnieper River in the north central part of the state, right? That Belarus is to the north, that Belarus is led by Lukashenko, who is really a puppet of Putin. And Putin would very much like to see Ukraine the same way, right? Have a president that is fully aligned with Putin. We also see, right, from the demographics, this is the 2001 census, not to my knowledge, a more recent one, but we can see, of course, Russian speakers predominant in Donetsk, Luhansk. These are the two. Ooh, let me see if I can get fancy with the pointer. Ooh, no, I try to get too fancy. Here we go. I'm gonna get it. Yeah, Donetsk and Luhansk, right? These are the easterly regions that Putin just declared as autonomous republics, and of course, Crimea to the south. So yes, Russian is the most oft-spoken language in those regions, and I think Professor Swarts is going to take up more, our questions, our queries about whether there's, reasonable thought that these regions could self-determine and join with Russia. Certainly in 2014, there was a referendum in Crimea where that seemed to be the result, right? Where 97% of the 80% that took part of the referendum chose Russia, but we'll talk a little bit about the wording on the referendum and why that didn't really, I think, present a clear, honest choice for what Crimea truly wanted. Nevertheless, right, all polities have to work with diverse populations, all polities, right? The US, South Africa, India. We all have, identities of class, of race, of ethnicity, of, religion. And we can't go redrawing the map every time we want to put people together because people have multiple identities. So I personally sort of reject the notion that Putin is advocating that, these Russian-speaking populations are totally shut out of the political process. Not true, right? Because we've had, as we'll see here, we've had presidents that are heavily aligned, that have been heavily aligned with Russia and with Putin. We've just also had ones that aren't, and that's democracy, that's competition, and that's precisely what Putin doesn't want to see. So between 1994 and 2005, we have President Leonid Kuchma, right, heavily aligned with Putin and with Russia, but his regime is marred by scandals of corruption, also by the murder of Georgi Gangadze. And I'm glad to see students from my class on Central and Eastern Europe, where we discussed the assassination of Gangadze, the brutal murder, and the fact that, lack of transparency in this murder has underlined the lack of rule of law in Ukraine. Nevertheless, right, when we look at Freedom House, which measures levels of democracy in the world, right, Russia, it measures it on a score from 0 to 100, 100 being best, 0 being worst, right? Russia's at 19, Ukraine is at 61, the US is at 83. So again, Russia at 19, Ukraine at 61, US at 83. So I think, again, Putin looks at Ukraine, and 61 for a 31-year-old country is not so shabby, right? It could be a lot worse. It could be a lot worse if democracy is your goal. So moving along, right? 2004, we're going through the first decade, and hey, Russia has an ally in the presidential office. But then the regional dynamics are not in his favor. 2004, right? Countries are joining NATO, as Professor Rupp talked about. 10 are entering the European Union. I remember being in Poland on May 1st, 2004, when Poland entered the European Union. There's people there waving the European flags. There's Eurosceptics there waving their flags against the EU. But the dynamics were not looking in Putin's favor at that moment. Perhaps that's why later that year during the Ukrainian presidential elections, we see that the main opposition candidate, right, Viktor Yushchenko, suffers dioxin poisoning. His slide's a little bit covered up, but maybe you're familiar with the face that's scarred by chemical poisoning of dioxin. So it wasn't successful in the sense of killing the opposition candidate, but it definitely, sent shockwaves through the system. Viktor Yanukovych, who was the Russian allied candidate, he did declare a victory, but there were pretty egregious election violations in that election. The Supreme Court of Ukraine worked to set in motion a runoff between those two candidates. We saw the Orange Revolution supporters of Yushchenko out on the main square, and Yushchenko won. So a candidate that wasn't in Putin's favor. We see him pictured there with Yulia Tymoshenko, right? So you might say, if you're a Russian speaker in Ukraine, it's an opposition candidate, the system is shutting me out, I'm a minority, I don't have any voice in this new system, Russia, come save me, right? But not so clear, right? Because in the very next election, Viktor Yanukovych wins the presidency. It's not as if Russians are completely shut out of this system. He won the election. He didn't serve his full term, right? Because he backed out of negotiations that Ukraine had taken with the EU. Ukrainians who are more pro-EU could not accept that and felt he had gone too far. So we saw the Euromaidan protests in 2013. Yanukovych did not serve his full term. He fled the country. We had an acting president. He was followed by President Poroshenko. Poroshenko, right, is somebody who I guess Putin could characterize as an oligarch, the chocolate king, right? Somebody who has money, which we aren't surprised in any country to see that candidates who kind of filter to the top for major elite office have resources and have some wealth. Nevertheless, Poroshenko takes on a strategy of military, of trying to build the Ukrainian military, of trying to assert the Ukrainian national language as the official language and not accepting Russian as an official language. And lastly, separating the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Russian Orthodox Church, right? So these are steps that Putin's not going to like to see. So again, maybe unsurprising that at this moment, when it's looking like Ukraine is really asserting its independence, its sovereignty, its separate steps away from Russia, that there's the Crimean Referendum. There's a little political cartoon there showing the referendum process. The two choices are basically, in Crimea, do you wish to be a subject of Russia with the rights that entails? Or do you wish to go back to 1992 Crimea, which is a pretty unclear wording in the sense that it hadn't exactly been pinned down in the early 1992 that Crimea was in fact part of Ukraine. So the ballot basically looks like, do you want to be part of Russia or do you want to be part of not Ukraine? So really nice ballot design so that either way can kind of be interpreted as Crimea separating from Ukraine. Anyway, so there's a protracted conflict there, right? Council on Foreign Relations estimates that 10,000 people have been killed since the Russian invasion of troops after the Crimean referendum. And so, we've seen that this conflict, it pulls in other actors in Europe, right? Because a Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukrainian airspace pretty much by Russian missiles that were pulled in from Russia proper into Ukrainian territory. More recently, though, we've seen the presidency of Vladimir Zelensky, somebody who is not an oligarch, somebody who is an actor, who plays on this show, Servant of the People, right? Who convinced the majority of Ukrainian voters that he would do a good job representing their interests. So he's not, a Putin guy. He's not an oligarch. Again, I think this shows kind of the pluralism, the political competition that has emerged in Ukraine over the expanse of 30 years. And this is why Putin had to invade. So I will hand over this to Professor Swarts. Thank you.
The way I'm going to approach this is by talking a little bit about U.S. foreign policy and kind of what this might entail for us going forward and for the world going forward. And it's essentially to give you some of my own reflections on what I've been thinking about in the last few days and how this fits into kind of the bigger issues of international relations that Richard touched on at the beginning. For those of us in political science and that teach international relations like Megan, Richard, and I do, so much of what we do is defined by the experience of the Second World War and then the Cold War. I mean, in many ways, 1945 on to 1991, and then what's happened since 1991. And we talk a lot in our classes about how, for those 45 years after the Second World War, the world really was defined by the superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so we were obsessed with them and they were obsessed with us. Well, what's happened in the last 30 years is we've essentially taken our eye off of Russia in many ways because that competition came to an end. And it's almost as if there was kind of a pause in traditional ways of thinking of international relations. As Richard said, that the dominant way of thinking, the one that dominated during the Cold War, was this notion of realism, which is that states will pursue their interests, states will pursue power, and that ultimately international relations is not about cooperation, but it's about competition. It's about competition for resources and power and influence. Well, at the end of the Cold War in 1991, it was almost as if perhaps we had seen the end of history, we had seen the end of the big ideological divisions that we were also familiar with in the 20th century, that somehow maybe we were in a new world. The former Soviet Union, as Richard pointed out, was split up. It was economically in chaos. It really looked to be a much weakened opponent. And so the 1990s were in a way really kind of a, remember back in the 1990s, it was kind of almost a golden period where it felt like the West had won the Cold War, everything was fine, superpower rivalry was over, and we were all going to live happily ever after. Now, of course, that came to an end with September 11, 2001, but in a way, we just rediverted our attention onto something else, which was international terrorism. And so while we're kind of distracted, you might say, by the 1990s and then with the threat of international terrorism since, it didn't mean that the old principles, the old laws of political gravity had gone away. We've just seen them reemerge, but they've been there all along. And then, of course, in the last 5 to 10 years, our focus in the United States and in the West generally has been on China and on the rise of China. And what does that mean for the US, for its interests, and for the rest of the world? And so the whole notion of focusing on Russia and focusing on the Russian threat seemed to a lot of people in the West to be almost misplaced. I mean, the kind of the classic example of this, and you may have seen this in the news the last few days, was that famous 2012 presidential debate when Mitt Romney brought up the issue of Russia, and President Obama kind of laughed and said, well, you know, the 1980s are calling, they want their foreign policy back. You know, this is not a problem today. And Madeleine Albright had done the same thing. She had kind of said something like, well, this is the 21st century, not the 20th. Interestingly, she went back and actually said, I was wrong. She's a couple of years ago, as we got attuned again to Russia, she said, I was wrong. It was there all along. But I think the West in general, and the United States specifically, I think kind of, again, I don't know if the word is distracted, but certainly focusing on other issues. But in many ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And so my feeling over the last few days have been, it's almost like we're back to the great power rivalries of the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, I'm not saying this is another Cold War, but it feels an awful lot like the 1970s, the 1980s, when Richard and I were in graduate school and studying these things, in college studying these things. So, for example, you've heard in recent days, you may have seen articles about Turkey closing the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Well, do we have,
Push the green button, not the red one. Not the red.
oh, or not quite. Yeah, not the red one.
You want to go down. Green.
I don't have one of Turkey though.
Oh, then you use one of mine. There you go.
Oh, you can kind of see it here. You've seen or may have seen articles about Turkey closing the Turkish Straits and the Dardanelles to shipping in and out of the Black Sea, specifically keeping Russia from transiting through the Hellespont through the Aegean Sea. Well, this is the old Straits question of the 1840s. I mean, this was a key issue of the 19th century, is who was going to control the Turkish Straits and who could get in and out of the Black Sea. It's really a sense of deja vu here. And then, as Richard also pointed out, this whole idea of having a protective flank in the West is just a perennial Russian concern, or might even say obsession. This extreme sensitivity to their Western flank is nothing new. It's key to the Russian view of their own security. And neither, so that's not new, and neither is Russia attacking its neighbors in order to preserve its Western flank. It did it to Poland in 1939. It did it to Hungary in 1956, and it did it in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So there's a history here of Russia invading its neighbors in order to protect or to strengthen that flank there. I guess I would sum up and kind of make 4 quick points. First, as I've said, in my view, the old patterns of international politics are back in many ways. At least it seems that way. We had a hiatus when it seemed like the great power rivalry maybe was gone for a while, or maybe was gone forever. I think we've seen that was a pretty naive view on our part, that it's back. And the old laws, as I said, of political gravity seem to still apply. And that is that big, powerful countries are going to seek power and interest and influence. The second thing is, I don't think there's any doubt that this is a major challenge to the way we in the West conceive the world, especially since 1945. In 1945, we have the creation of the United Nations, and we really have had an effort in the last 70 or 80 years to start seeing the world not as this kind of law of the jungle place where the strong prevail and the strong dominate the weak, but a system of based on international law, based on international principles. The idea that state sovereignty is inviolable, that countries should be able to, for example, go to the UN or go to international organizations and ask for support in supporting their own security. And so this no more obvious place was this true than in Europe. I mean, the whole idea of kind of collective security through international organizations and international norms came out of the World War II experience and came out of trying to protect the countries of Western Europe during the Cold War. That's under direct challenge. When you have a country that just simply for its own motivations, for its own reasons, attacks its neighbor and attempts to what looks like install some kind of puppet regime there, it's a direct challenge to the notions of the liberal small L international order that has been in existence more or less since the Second World War. Third, other countries are watching this closely, I think it's fair to say. Can Putin get away with it? I think is something that's going to be watched very closely in other places. And the two places that popped into my mind was, first of all, Taiwan. The whole idea of an authoritarian dictatorship seeking to, with irredentist claims. Irredentism is where you as a country have designs and have a claim on neighboring territory, have an irredentist claim to a much smaller, much weaker neighbor. Well, that seems to fit the example of Taiwan pretty clearly. It's very interesting. We haven't really talked about this very much, but the whole question of, what is the US role and what is the Western role in defending Ukraine? Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Had it been a member of NATO, none of this probably would have happened. I'm not saying that's an argument for it. I'm just saying you wouldn't have, Putin's got to be very careful attacking a NATO country, because then that invokes the security clause 5 of the NATO agreement, which gets all the other countries of NATO involved. We used to have a security arrangement with Taiwan. We no longer have that. As we've recognized the People's Republic of China, we have a much more ambiguous commitment to the security of Taiwan. It's not exactly spelled out. It's a kind of a strategic ambiguity. We're not sure exactly what our commitment is. The Chinese aren't exactly sure what our commitment is, and that may actually be to our benefit, that no one's quite sure what it means. But it does raise an interesting question. What would happen if the Chinese were emboldened to try to formally incorporate or reincorporate Taiwan into mainland China? The other example that also came to mind, and it's a little bit different, but also kind of has a similar tone to it, is the irredentist claims of Turkey. I don't know how many here follow domestic Turkish politics very much, but President Erdogan of Turkey over the last 5 or 7 years has made increasingly strident statements about how the islands of the Greek archipelago really rightfully belong to Turkey. And there's, as you can see from the map, virtually no blue water separating the islands of Greece from mainland Turkey. It would be extremely easy from a military point of view to see if you could make a land grab. Those of you that know me know that I have more than just a passing interest in this topic. My in-laws live right there on the island of Chios, and literally from their veranda can look across and see the Turkish mainland. This is not a theoretical, an issue of only theoretical concern. If someone like Erdogan feels like the West, the world will not respond to some kind of irredentist land grab, would that embolden someone like him to try it? Now, this whole issue of Turkey and Greece is complicated by the fact that both are NATO members. So does that make Greece more secure or less secure? I always tell my wife that actually makes Greece more secure, but then she points out rightly that if both are members of NATO, then maybe NATO says, well, we can't pick, so let them sort it out themselves. It's a really complicated issue. Finally, the fourth thing I was thinking about was exactly what Richard mentioned, and that is the question of, is Putin making a strategic error here? And I think it's maybe too early to tell. He certainly has accomplished something that the United States hasn't been able to accomplish in 70 years, and that's to unify NATO. He's gotten NATO unified. He's gotten most of the world seemingly unified. Germany, you might have seen in the last couple of days, have announced that they're going to raise their defense spending to what it looks like about 3% of GDP, which is much higher than they've ever had before. Germany, historically, since 1945, has essentially outsourced their defense to NATO and to the United States as kind of penance for their actions during World War II. Now it looks like Germany might actually become a defense power for the first time in modern history or post-war history. That's big. The other thing you might have also seen is that countries like Sweden and Finland have even started talking about whether or not they might want to join NATO. Clearly, NATO is seen as bolstering your own security and the collective security of Western countries. So there's interest now among the general publics of these countries of potentially joining. I'll just point out that if Finland ever decides to join NATO, you're going to see something, probably a similar reaction from the Russians as to what you see in Ukraine, because there again, you have the Western flank, and Finland being a country that throughout the entire post-war period was subservient to the Soviet Union by necessity. Essentially, the price of their independence during the Cold War was they had to remain neutral and essentially subservient to the Soviet Union. So, you know, joining NATO may sound like a great idea, but I think you have to tread very lightly there. So what happens really remains to be seen, I think. In many ways, it feels like the old days are come back. It's a very dangerous situation. I would just end by saying that, you know, the hopes of the past 30 years or so that somehow peace had broken out in Europe and was going to last for the foreseeable future has met a pretty rude awakening in the last week or so. So I'll just stop with there.
Thank you, John. So in a moment, we'll turn to your questions and comments. I just wanted to briefly note make an observation about what John had said about 9/11 and how the system changed after 9/11. All three of us, to one degree or another, have talked about Putin's miscalculations. I just want to note what I consider a major miscalculation of the United States after 9/11 that it impacts, in my opinion, Putin's decision-making and evaluating U.S. power, which was the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 and the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. I think that did enormous damage to American power and American prestige, and it weakened the United States. And the problem, the miscalculation, was what John is saying is not keeping your eye on the ball. Is Al-Qaeda was actually really a modest threat in comparison to what we're talking about here today. The Russians were never going away. And to be preoccupied with peripheral threats, if you're a major power and then consequently weaken yourself, I think we're seeing that today in how all these events are proceeding. So with that said, we'd like to open this up very much. There's a mic, which will probably, I know we can all hear each other probably, but just so the audience on Zoom can hear, if there are questions and comments, and it doesn't just have to be what our three different topics, it can be whatever you would like to raise today. So the mic is open. Who will be first? There we are.
Someone's got to start.
Right.
So I have a question. So could this potentially be the almost last hurrah of a dying superpower, someone who's trying to go at a last ditch effort to regain some of that power that they've lost over the last 30 years? Because as you mentioned, Russia's not an economic power. All they really have is their military. You think they're trying to regain some of that lost territory and build up a little more power, or at least try to?
That's a great question. So I think if I have it right, I was hearing this morning, they're G11, but maybe the 11th largest economy. So they still, I mean, they still have a basis for power, right? In terms of land, in terms of an economic position, even if it's not as dominant as it once was. I think it is going to depend a lot on the reaction of other states. So far, it looks like the reaction of Ukrainians is really more robust than maybe first expected, and the reaction of people like European Union Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen shutting off airspace. It'll just be interesting to see how it plays out, but that somehow I don't see it as a death knell. That would be my guess.
John?
It's a great question. And I don't think any of us have a great answer for it. I don't think we know. I would say that the reaction that we've seen, I think it surprised all of us probably, the reaction and the unity of the reaction, it does not bode well for Putin and for Russia into the future. I mean, clearly Russia's not going away. The question is, what will its form be in 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Will it be in kind of a corrupt oligarchic regime? Will it be something approaching a democracy? Will it be a democracy? I think that a lot of that depends on the reaction of the Russian people as well. Of course, you're dealing with, an authoritarian state in which people are thrown in jail and killed for opposing the regime. So it's not like we have a good sense of what Russians are thinking themselves right now. We certainly know what Eastern Europeans think. And I'll just make an editorial comment here. Sometimes NATO is perceived or is portrayed as somehow being on some kind of morally equivalent plane with the Warsaw Pact. But you have to remember that the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's military alliance, was imposed, as Richard said, by the military occupation of those countries and by force. The expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, whether it was a wise thing to do or not from a strategic point of view, was done at the invitation of all of those countries who wanted to join NATO. So from a Eastern European point of view, outside of Russia, clearly NATO is a very popular thing, and it got a lot more popular in the last week because it's seen as an alliance of democratic countries that are engaged in an effort of mutual defense. So I guess getting back to your original question, I think it remains to be seen. Clearly, the efforts by the West to put sanctions on the Russian regime and to really cause economic turmoil is, even if it's not stated publicly, is intended to undermine the legitimacy of that regime and to bring about, mass dissatisfaction with the regime. So perhaps someday there would be regime change, but he's not going to go quickly or easily.
But eventually he will go, but Russia will stay. That's the thrust of when we're talking about 400 years of history. Russia has never had anything but an authoritarian ruler. Some of them have been extraordinarily violent. I wouldn't want to be quoted saying, if you scratch a Russian, you scratch an authoritarian, but the country does not have a history of democracy. There were hopes in the 90s with Yeltsin, but hopes, but nothing really to base that upon. So I do not envision this to be the last gasp of Russia at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I might not finish my sentence. I'm Ukrainian. Okay. So I'm emotionally involved in all of this. So how far is the rest of the world willing to go to stop Putin? I mean, I don't think he's going to stop. The guy's a little bit Hitlerish. Okay, he's going to take Ukraine, then he's going to start taking the rest of them back. I mean, when you showed that map, USSR went all the way up to Germany. There's all the Czech Republic. There's, so many countries there are there that he's not going to stop. The guy's hungry and power hungry, and he wants to show the world that, you can't stop me. So how is NATO and the rest of the world what are they willing to do to stop him is my question.
All right, I'll go first. That's a very powerful and emotional question, to be sure. I do not envision the West using direct military power to push Russia out of Ukraine, as the West did in Kuwait in 1991 to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I think there are a number of factors that explain that. In the immediate, the West doesn't have those resources. The West may collectively be much more powerful than Russia, but NATO is not the power it was in 1991 when we had 330,000 troops permanently deployed in Europe on the front line on the Fulda Gap. So the West at present does not have military resources in the theater to confront this kind of invasion. So I think, however, what I've seen in the last week is that the initial bite of sanctions is one having a psychological impact, because you're seeing that in Moscow and throughout Russia, but it's becoming increasingly clear that this is going to make the Russian economy scream. Putin might not give a rat's ass about that, but we will see what transpires with the Russian people, because the Russian people have become accustomed to a certain standard of living, but that standard of living is predicated on the import of manufactured goods. Again, you don't have anything on your person right now from Russia. They don't produce things, and that's going to be cut off. They are becoming a pariah. And importantly, I would say, and this I think we should have done I think my perspective, the biggest foreign policy blunder of the Obama years was not effectively responding to Crimea. And I believe this has changed that. I believe you will see permanent, but Putin his goal was to get the West out of Eastern Europe. And this, as John said, this is having just the opposite response. The Germans have finally decided to cut the check. And you're going to see substantial forces put in all of the frontline states. And again, to go back to Putin being somewhat rational, the idea of making an intrusion into Lithuania or Estonia, if there are frontline NATO troops there and you will be killing Americans on the first day, that changes the calculation. I would like to say that I think Putin has been astoundingly reckless in talking about nuclear weapons during this conflict. No Soviet leader would have done that. And this then does lead us to questioning because people are questioning his, not only the rationality, but his judgment at this point. And I've heard pretty senior people, General Clapper referred to him as insane. I don't go that far. I'm not willing to go that far. I think he's ruthless in what he's trying to do, but recklessly talking about the use of nuclear weapons, and conversely, how President Biden has so soberly put that down.
Maybe briefly, I would just say, though I don't know if if it offers much succor to somebody who has Ukrainian roots, like the fact of economic sanctions, the freezing of assets from the Russian central bank, right? Kind of blockading Russia economically might be more effective in the short and long run than we think. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how cyber attack and stuff plays out here, because I just expect that pretty much any moment. Like, how is that type of conflict going to play out on both sides? Because that can be, I think, more devastating than we expect, than we anticipate. And even though there's 175,000 at least Russian troops in Belarus and marching through 40-mile right convoy making its way to Kiev, maybe these more indirect economic levers can be of some kind of assistance in fighting Putin.
Do we have anyone from the chat?
We had a great question from the chat. A question from Professor Jen Liu: would having two official languages, both Ukrainian and Russian, help to foster inclusion? Successful democratic countries such as Canada and Switzerland have multiple official languages.
That's for you.
Oh, that's true. I should have said, no, there are no questions. No, okay, so I think it is an excellent question. So I think this is being played out in the Baltic countries as well, right? Right, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they've been, making their their indigenous non-Russian language the official language and not recognizing Russian, and in some cases forcing Russians in the near abroad to learn that new language as a precondition for citizenship and for voting in national elections. Certainly there were moves in Ukraine to make Russian official at the local level. There was a case that proceeded up to the Supreme Court in Ukraine about to try to establish Russian as an official language. I think with the influence of Russian media throughout Ukraine, it's just a very slippery slope to create the Russian language as official in Ukraine, but maybe there's some other middle ground.
Well, I would say during the Soviet period, the Moscow required basically elites to speak Russian. So it was part of their control and destruction of Ukraine, that if you wanted to be a leader in Ukraine, you could not attend university. You really needed to speak Russian. And that's a bit about what this war is about. This idea of Russian hegemony. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were 25 million Russian nationals living in the various republics. About 12 to 15 million were in Ukraine. So that is also a major component of this conflict, because you still have a great many Russian nationals in Ukraine. The language question is a fascinating one, because it was also in the Baltics, is that the Soviets requiring Russian to be spoken in the Baltics. And that was one of their very first pushbacks in 91, 92, which is tell the Russians, you need to learn Latvian. And that was really tough for the Russians. They saw that as a huge humiliation. But you had a lot of Russian, especially ex-Russian military, because the Baltics were the more pleasant place to live in the Soviet Empire. And so, yeah, the Latvians, Lithuanians played hardball. They say, no, if you want to be a part of Latvia, you need to speak Latvian.
So I've really appreciated this forum, and I kind of want to take a slightly different angle of thinking about not just what's happening there, but how that impacts some of the stuff and the reactions we're having here. So, CPAC, you have two very different approaches that are coming out in conservative conversations. So you have Tucker Carlson supporting Russia, supporting Putin. You have other, leaders in the Republican Party still speaking out against. I think we have our own experience over the last 4 years of what can happen with authoritarian kind of strength ideas. And so how is this playing out going to continue to impact kind of how we see our own democracy that has been in the slide for the last 4 years?
We're not taking any political questions.
Oh, you're looking at me, Richard?
I am. I'm thinking of my answer, so you go ahead.
I'll just give you my off the cuff response, and that would be that take a look at old pictures from 1991 of the George Bush administration, and look at the adults that were in the room there. Whether you agreed with his administration or not, whether you're politically on one side or the other, if you looked at the people that were involved at that time, people like Scowcroft and Colin Powell and George Shultz, and if you think of all of those people from the Republican mainstream, again, whether you agree with or disagree with their politics, they took the standard American view of how to deal with the Soviet Union, how to deal with Russia, the one that had developed over the last 45 years. This is just my editorial comment, my personal view. That's the kind of approach we need from the Republican Party today, because that's the one that essentially won the Cold War. I mean, that's the one that essentially kept Russia, the Soviet Union, where it was. That's why we had 45 years of a cold peace, but a peace nonetheless. And so, yeah, talking about somehow trying to rationalize or justify Russian actions in this case, it's totally outside the mainstream of all of American foreign policy, Democratic or Republican.
But it's happening. So how
It is happening.
We can say that they shouldn't, but
Here's where I think rationality, we get back to rationality again. And it's one thing to say it on TV, but when you're actually having to make decisions about what American foreign policy should be, I think, again, those kind of laws of gravity come back into play. And the idea, and it's just, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm naive, but it's just unthinkable to me that the United States could take any other position but to oppose what's going on and to strengthen NATO as a result. Because the whole key to American and Western security in Europe is based on the strength of NATO, and it's based on the collective security agreement between them. And the credibility of that agreement has to be maintained no matter what. And that's why, going back to Tanya's question, you're not going to see NATO involving itself in Ukraine, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, because they're not a member of NATO. And the United States doesn't want to get into a shooting war with the Russians, unfortunately for Ukraine. Will Putin move into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland? No, I don't think so, because those are all members of NATO. And the key to NATO is the credibility of the commitment that each country will defend each other. If you lose that credibility, if Estonia somehow gets sucked back into the Russian orbit without any opposition, then all of a sudden the credibility of NATO just goes right down the drain. So I don't think those countries are at risk. And that's exactly why those non-member countries want to join NATO, is because of that commitment. So
Meg, did
I
you
don't
wanna-
have a good answer to your question either.
Maybe just to add to John, a look, yeah, to agree and underline, right, that transatlantic relationship between the US and like-minded, countries with similar values, similar systems. I wouldn't see why we wouldn't side with people who share those values and share those behaviors versus support somebody like Putin, right, who's associated with murder of journalists, poisoning of rivals, assassinations. That's not the company I like to keep.
Right.
I don't think that's the company that anybody in here likes to keep. So
Well, maybe Tucker Carlson, because I do watch Fox News periodically, and to watch his commentary on a nightly basis continues to speak of the implosion of a certain wing, although that wing is pretty large, of the Republican Party. And we have a gentleman in the room, Tim Sanders, who worked for one of the Republicans that John spoke of, Senator Lugar from this state for many years. And Senator Lugar, supported by old line Republicans like Tim and Tanya Sanders, that was the base of the party. And I continue to be extraordinarily concerned that when you have a liberal, a democracy, and you only have two political parties, they both must be committed to liberal democracy. And we have a very serious problem at this point. And the thought that we continue to look for moments of, again, the adults in the room. After January 6th, we were looking for the adults in the room in the months after, and now we're still looking for adults in the room. It makes for a very, very difficult, and this certainly is something that Putin is very much aware of and has fueled. He has very much fueled and cultivated a relationship here.
I would just emphasize, add to that, to say that, it's something we always talk about in our classes, is that historically, American foreign policy, at least during the Cold War years, was essentially nonpartisan. There was not a great deal of difference between the two parties when it came to foreign policy. Huge differences on domestic policy, but in terms of strength, in terms of support for NATO, in terms of support for our Western allies, in terms of commitment to liberal democracy, I mean, you can see that whether you're talking about, I don't know, Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, or Reagan and the evil empire. I mean, it's different language, it's different approach perhaps, but it's the same fundamental policy of supporting our Western allies and now our Eastern European allies. So yes, the emergence of division on that point is troublesome.
Take one or two more questions. Yes.
Yeah, so say if Russia were to secede though in the invasion of Ukraine, like what would that look like? You guys brought up how they would be interested to place a satellite like puppet regime in charge, but would they like take any of like the separatist land? Are they only invading through like into the separatist territories and willing to take that, or are they trying to go in and take all of it, you think?
It's reasonably clear. We were looking for the different routes of the potential invasion, and it turned out to be our worst scenario. The worst scenario hasn't unfolded. It's a comprehensive land and air invasion and naval operations on the Black Sea. So the indication is it's an effort in the moment to decapitate the government. President Zelensky is on a kill list. And after the decapitation of the government, then the control of the system comprehensively, and then establishing some level of political control from Moscow. And that is a real possibility here. Again, because it does not seem that the West would use military force to prevent that. Again, you can make the economy scream, but if your adversary is willing to accept that cost, it will happen. One of the areas for, I'm going to say hope, but for opposition to Putin is domestically. That will prove to be more and more interesting as the weeks go by. But yeah, this is the first time I say Soviets, it's not a bad phrase. The Russian has these. John mentioned Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68. You were a little young for that, but both of those were examples of the East Europeans' opposition to the communist rule that had been imposed in the mid '40s and later '40s, and they were crushed ruthlessly Moscow sent in 5,000 tanks to Hungary in 56. And the puppet regime was reestablished. It remains to be seen what this situation will look like. I'm not too up, with a good friend in in the room who's Ukrainian. It's not my pleasure to say that I don't want to say Ukraine is lost, but it is going to be very difficult to reverse this.
Okay, thank you.
Any final questions, chat?
There was a question in the chat from Professor Duzinkiewicz asking, what are the essential differences between Ukrainians and Russians? I was trying to think about that myself. Yeah.
I wish he
there's-
was, I'm sorry, we can't let him speak because he's a specialist in the field and he would like to hear from us. I would not, well,
I guess leaders have been, President Poroshenko of Ukraine would try to say, hey, we have some religious common threads, but we're trying to say there's a separate Ukrainian Orthodox Church and a separate Russian Orthodox Church, right? That those are somehow distinct. Orientation toward a pluralist liberal democracy within Ukraine, and that not being a heavy priority within the Russian Federation, and East versus West orientation. Those are differences that come to mind for me.
I don't have a good answer to that question either. I would just say that, I think it's important to think about this essentially an identity question. And identity may have some kind of tangible real world roots, but a lot of it is socially constructed. It's a lot of identity is what we conceive identity to be. So, what do Ukrainians think they are? What do Russians think they are? Do they think of themselves as the same or different, or to what degree are they different? It is largely a social question. I would just say, and Professor Duzinkiewicz is the person to answer this. It's too bad he's not on the mic so we could hear him. But Ukraine is really one of those areas of Eastern Europe that has almost too much. They're the wrong geography in the sense that it has been historically a place of great diversity. I mean, the issue of religion has been mentioned. Religion has been an extremely divisive issue in Ukraine for centuries. You had Orthodox Christians, you had Byzantine Catholic Christians, you had Roman Rite Christians, and now you have a split within the Orthodox Church between those that that are loyal to a Kiev patriarch and those that are loyal to a Moscow patriarch. So even in the case of religion, you've got an incredible amount of diversity in this relatively small geographic area. And of course, you could add to that the linguistic diversity we've seen on the screen. Ukraine, unfortunately, finds itself in one of those, I don't know what the word is exactly, but one of those territories in kind of East Central Europe that has traditionally been at the forefront of the pull of the great powers. And religion is a great example of how the country has in some parts leaned west and in other parts leaned east. You can see that in, like, as I said, the difference between the different religious groups there.
sure. I wouldn't quite put it that way. The territory of Ukraine, one has been contested between the Lithuanian Empire, the Polish Empire, and the Russian Empire, as you know. And the greater Ukrainian region came under the, they would say, the yoke of Moscow in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Catherine the Great. I wouldn't differentiate communist and the imperial period. But I wanted to, our question on Ukrainian identity is fascinating. And I would say one thing, maybe we'll close on this note, that Meg did a splendid job of talking about political contestation and plurality and pluralism in Ukraine. And there are clearly authoritarians in Ukraine, but there are clearly Democrats. I think many more Democrats in Ukraine, and their voice is has been articulated. I believe there are also to be Democrats in Russia, but Putin has been so effective in crushing not only dissent, but free speech. Russian media controls everything. And so we're not hearing from the Russian people as we heard from the Ukrainian people. And I do think that's a distinction. And again, if you're looking for some of the Achilles heel of Russia, it's not in a nuclear confrontation. It's in weakening that component of Russian identity. So I want to thank everyone, particularly my colleagues, Meg Rincker and John Swarts, for being with me today. I have to say, we'll revisit this topic with you as the times go forward. Thank you all very, very much.